My sister called me on a Saturday morning and said, Claire, we need $50,000 and we need it in 30 days. And I said, okay, Rebecca, tell me what happened. And she told me, and I said, let me look at some things and I'll call you back. And I hung up and I sat at the kitchen table where 6 months earlier she had sat across from me and said, you know, Claire, some of us actually have careers. And I had smiled and passed her the coffee and said nothing. And now I opened my laptop and I pulled up the account I had been building quietly for 7 years. Through the consulting work I did from that same kitchen table between school pickups and soccer practices and grocery runs, and I looked at the balance and I thought about the call I was about to make back to Rebecca, and I thought about what I was going to say and what I was not going to say, and I decided that the most powerful thing I could do in this moment was simply say yes and let the yes do everything the argument never could. Hi everyone, welcome back. And if you're new here, today's story is one where the ending is not dramatic, and the most important moment is actually the quietest one. So stay with me, because what this story is really about is what happens when the people who dismissed you discover, in the most practical possible way, that they were wrong. My name is Claire Whitmore, and I am 38 years old, and I have been a stay-at-home parent for 7 years, meaning I left a marketing position when my first child was born and have been home since, managing our household, raising our 3 kids, and also, for the past 5 years, running a small freelance consulting practice out of my home office that my family has never once asked about in any detail, because they categorized me as a stay-at-home mom the moment I stopped going to an office, and nothing I have done since has updated that category in their minds. My family's attitude toward my life choices had been consistent since the moment I left my position, and it sounded like this. My sister Rebecca, who worked in finance, made comments about staying intellectually engaged and hoped I was keeping my skills sharp. My mother said things like Claire has always been content with a simpler life. My brother-in-law asked at a family dinner if I ever missed having something of my own, and my cousin at a Christmas gathering said in front of several people that it must be nice to not have to worry about work. And I had absorbed all of these comments for 7 years with the specific patience of someone who had decided that explaining herself was less interesting than simply continuing to build what she was building and letting the results eventually be self-evident. What my family did not know, because they had never asked and I had never volunteered, was that the consulting practice I had built over 5 years from our home office was not a hobby and was not supplemental income in the way that phrase usually sounds. It was a genuine practice with 11 ongoing client relationships, several of which were with companies my family members would recognize, and the revenue it generated was significant, enough that my husband and I had been able to pay off our mortgage 2 years early and build a savings position that represented genuine financial stability. And none of this was secret exactly. It simply required someone to ask, and nobody in my family had ever asked, because they had stopped seeing me as someone with a career the day I stopped leaving the house for one. Rebecca's situation, when she explained it on that Saturday phone call, was a real financial emergency. Her husband's small business had hit a cash flow crisis tied to a delayed contract payment that had cascaded into several other obligations coming due simultaneously. And they needed a bridge loan of $50,000 for approximately 30 days to cover the gap until the contract payment arrived. And they had already spoken to their bank, and the timeline did not work for a traditional loan to process in time, and they had no one else to ask. And Rebecca said, Claire, I know this is a lot to ask, and I said, tell me the specifics, and she did, and I said, let me call you back, and she said, okay. I called her back 40 minutes later, after pulling together the relevant account information and doing a quick calculation about liquidity timing, and I said, Rebecca, I can do this. And she said, really? And I said, yes, and she said, Claire, I don't know what to say, and I said, you don't have to say anything yet. And she said, how are you? Where is this coming from? And I said, what do you mean? And she said, I didn't know you had this kind of money, Claire. And I said, I know you didn't. And she said, the consulting. I knew you did some consulting, but I thought, and she stopped. And I said, you thought what, Rebecca? And she said, I thought it was more of a side thing. And I said, it's been a full practice for 5 years. And she said, I didn't know. And I said, I know I want to be precise about what I did next, because I think The how matters more than the what in this part of the story, which is that I did not lecture Rebecca about 7 years of comments. I did not list the specific moments when she had implied my life was lesser or my work was less real. I did not use the $50,000 as an opportunity to make her feel small the way I had sometimes felt small at family gatherings. I simply transferred the money with a standard informal loan agreement that my husband and I had drawn up. Reasonable terms, a genuine 30-day timeline matching their need. And I said, Rebecca, I need you to do one thing for me. And she said, anything? And I said, I want you to come to dinner next week. And she said, of course. And I said, just you, not the whole family, just you and me. And she said, okay, at dinner the following Thursday, Rebecca came to my house and I made dinner in the same kitchen where she had told me some of us actually have careers. And after we ate, I showed her my office, which is a dedicated room with 2 monitors and a filing system and client folders organized by industry. And I walked her through what I actually do, not to prove anything, but because she had asked me to explain it over dinner. And it was the first time in 7 years she had genuinely asked. And Rebecca sat in the chair across from my desk and said, Claire, how long has this room been here? And I said, 5 years. And she said, I've been in this house a dozen times. And I said, I know. And she said, I never asked what was in here. And I said, no, you didn't. And she said, I assumed. And I said, I know you did. And she said, I owe you more than an apology. And I said, start with the apology and we'll see how the rest goes. And she laughed. And it was the first real laugh between the two of us in longer than I wanted to admit. She repaid the loan in 28 days and included a note that said, thank you for not making me feel small. When you could have, and I kept the note in the client folder, I had opened for the transaction, labeled with her name, which felt appropriate, and my mother called me a few weeks after. The loan was repaid and said Rebecca told me about what you did, and I said it was just a loan, Mom. And my mother said she also told me about the office, and I said yes, and my mother said, Claire, why didn't you ever tell us? And I said because nobody ever asked, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, I'm asking now, and that was the most honest conversation my mother and I have had in 7 years, and it started with a question she should have asked years earlier, and it took $50,000 and a 30-day loan and a room that had been 2 monitors and 11 client folders for 5 years to finally get her to ask it, and I answered the whole thing.